All right, well, next up we have Nathan Mueller. He's, like I mentioned earlier, extension educator located up in Fremont. He does quite a bit with wheat. We've done a couple different things where he comes in and talks about wheat. As you know, I work a lot in the weather world, and so I think wheat has a lot of applications for reducing risk to weather events. And so a lot of the things that I preach about involve wheat. So hence why we're talking about wheat. So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nathan. And as always, feel free to jump into questions. He gave you a couple handouts, and sure he'll mention those. So anyway, thanks
Yep.
again for coming.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I was just gave a wheat program in Fremont last night, so we had 24 people come in Fremont, and for our area, I was really surprised how many people turned out. And so there was a good mix of people that were thinking about it. Some guys I already convinced to start. I convinced 5 farmers already just in Dodge and Washington to plant wheat for the first time this fall, and then we had a couple of veterans in the room. So um, my background a little bit, actually, I got my first experience with winter wheat with Steve Benzinger. I worked for him as a undergrad in the greenhouses in both harvest in the summer. I grew up on a dairy farm in Dodge in Washington County. After we got done with my master's degree here at UNL, we moved to Indiana. My wife went to school at Purdue, and I worked for the Department of Ag, working in soil conservation. Uh, Closely with NRCS partners, and then I did my PhD at K-State in micronutrient research in corn and soybeans. And then after I got my PhD done, I was a professor and the state extension agronomist for South Dakota out of Brookings, covering the whole state, and then eventually towards the end, just the eastern part. But while at South Dakota, one of my main roles as the extension agronomist was also running the variety testing program, which was no small effort. So we had both the program in the east and the west. We had 7 employees, and I did winter wheat, spring wheat, oats, field peas, grain sorghum, testing across the state. So pretty much everything other than sunflowers, I was in charge of for variety testing. So really got to know both winter wheat and spring wheat through that, and extension programmings across the state. And I was there, we were losing acres the years I was there in both spring wheat and winter wheat in South Dakota because of increased drought tolerance in corn, and corn moving further west in the state. So um, but there was a lot of value to wheat. And so we're going to take some of what I've learned from moving around, and how does this apply to Eastern Nebraska, and where does it fit? And so I'm going to try to share with you this morning. So I am going to go over a little bit of historical data and perspective on where we used to be for acres and yield and where we're at now. I think variety selection, after you've done variety testing for corn and soybeans, winter wheat, you learn that this is probably one of the most critical routine management decisions we make every year. You're already making seed selection purchases for early seed discounts in September, October already for corn and soybeans. Recommended planting practices. We're going to go over planting dates, seeding rates, seed treatment, some basics there. Also, just knowing what you're seeding. For a lot of new guys running the drill for the first time, making sure you're actually seeding the rate that you want isn't as easy as they thought, okay? Then we'll go over nutrient management, some of the nutrients that we're concerned about here in Eastern Nebraska, both nitrogen and phosphorus, macronutrients, but also sulfur and chloride, and then a little bit on disease management. So historical perspective here in Eastern Nebraska. This actually, one of the people last night actually works for USDA NASS that came to the meeting in Fremont, works with this, but Northeast Nebraska was the crop reporting districts, region 6 and then 9. So we have these 3 areas that I'm kind of show some data. So in the red here is Southeast Nebraska, planted wheat acres. In the green, planted wheat acres for East Central Nebraska, which is Lancaster, just north here, and then Southeast or Northeast Nebraska here in blue. So one obvious thing is Northeast Nebraska has never really had a lot of winter wheat. And part of that had to do with winter hardiness as we moved north. If I would have added Southeast South Dakota on here, you'd see a very interesting trend where there was hardly any winter wheat, and they have more winter wheat now in Southeast South Dakota than they used to. But spring wheat acres have gone down. Weather's changed a little bit. There's higher yields with winter wheat. They were actually, if you look at the eastern fringe of what I call the winter wheat growing region, they had the highest yield. They averaged 70 bushels last year across the whole reporting district, across all those counties. So they're growing pretty good wheat just in Southeast South Dakota. So little blip here in acres, but we're still going down in 2017. This is through 2016, 44,000 acres. So again, down from last year. Actually, this is the first time USDA didn't report the acres for Northeast and East Central Nebraska. They didn't report them this year, or the yields. So I'll have to give Ben and USDA and NASA a hard time. So what does that look like spatially, though, across the eastern part here? Well, we were always low back in 1958, less than 1,000 acres, but we had a lot of acres, pretty much from Dodge, Washington, along the Platte River south. Now we fast forward to 2016, still have some acres, but less, but very lost a lot here in the east central part of the state. But what do yields look like? So it would have been good for Steve to maybe give us a little bit of insight here on this figure, but yields are fairly flat from the 70s through the 90s, and then right around the 90s, really have seen an increase in yields across all regions. So just like corn and soybeans, they've made a lot of genetic gains in corn and soybeans. That's been part of the demise of winter wheat because they've been for breeding. But we're really, looks like we're doing a great job for breeding really since the mid-90s. And again, Northeast Nebraska, actually, they were close to 70 bushels last year for crossed. And there's not a lot of growers. Randy Rink's one of them that has wheat in his rotation near Pender every 5th year. So one of the few growers that it's in a 5-year cycle. Most of the growers that I'm working with, it's this field, that field changes and moves around, but not a set year in rotation. So when and where winter wheat works. So I started a year and a half ago a program or a local initiative called Winter Wheat Works Initiative. And what that first started was working with 2 growers that had been growing wheat at least for 15 years, both of them, and asked them, what do you need? What would be important to you? And the first thing they said was variety selection. So working with Steve Benzinger and Tashomi Ragasi, I said, what would it take to get a variety trial north of the Platte River? Because we haven't had one in 35 years. And they just made it happen. They said if you have a grower that would be willing to host it, you'd be willing to help take some of the measurements and help with doing some of that work, we can do that. And so that's what we did. So we had a variety trial in Washington County for the first time this past year, had 43 people at the field day, and got that planted again this fall. And I'll show you what some of that data looked like from that location. Tyler just mentioned this, so that was awesome. How does wheat fit into perspective? And we dealt with this a lot in the central part of South Dakota where we are short of moisture. But obviously when your these crops, wheat definitely needs water, in our area here in Eastern Nebraska during the wettest months of the year. So May and June, some of our wettest months, is kind of peak water use, right? And then corn and soybeans, corn's a little bit earlier during pollination, soybeans a little bit later. So if you didn't have crop insurance, this would be one obvious way to mitigate risk in terms of a summer drought, right? Wheat's not going to be impacted as much, but crop insurance is a part of that, but it does mitigate risk, but it also spreads out workload. There were still a lot of farmers in South Dakota that I worked with. It was just them and maybe their son running the operation, had quite a few acres, and one way to make that work for them was keeping wheat in the rotation, just to distribute workload so they didn't have to hire another person when it came to fall and spring. So that's a consideration as well. But overall water use, estimated water use here in Eastern Nebraska, it is less for winter wheat, 16 to 18 inches over that growing season, so less total water use, and then opportunity, like Paul said, to grow something after wheat. And sometimes we get some pretty good moisture in August. July is usually pretty low, but it's not uncommon in our area to get good moisture in August. So opportunity for a late forage crop, especially up in my area where we have quite a bit of beef cattle. So what are some other benefits? Manure management flexibility. This is going to be a big one for us because I'm right at the epicenter of the Costco processing plant that's going to be located there in Lincoln Premium Poultry. We're going to have a lot of barns. And so we're going to have a lot of people that haven't had livestock before, haven't had to manage manure. And the question is, are they going to get their own equipment and do it, or are they going to hire it done? Because there's already custom haulers and applicators in the area because of the feedlots. My biggest concern, and why I've been pushing wheat too, is if those custom applicators, if we have a wet fall followed by a wet spring, how is all that manure going to get applied in a timely fashion to meet their manure management plan? So maybe wheat would be one opportunity for them to have a field of winter wheat to add that flexibility or have some flexibility. Or if you're another grower and you want some of that poultry litter, it's going to be a lot easier to buy it or convince them if you have a field of winter wheat to get that manure bought if it's in high demand, if you can get hauled those months. Value of straw. A lot of the growers that are adding winter wheat up north here, they're looking at straw. Close enough to Omaha, some dairies. So one guy's already planning on trying to market it to a dairy. the straw. Forage crop, late season forage crop. The other one, the long-term benefit, and we struggled with this because we didn't have a lot of data, but I worked with growers in South Dakota, was what's the benefit of wheat in the rotation? You know, in the central part of South Dakota, they were seeing about, a 20 bushel yield increase, corn following wheat versus corn following soybeans. Let's move to a higher moisture areas. This work was done at Monmouth in western Illinois, so plenty of moisture, great lush soils there. Just having wheat in the rotation, they're seeing about a 3 to 4 bushel benefit just by having wheat in the rotation there in western Illinois. So the question is, what's the benefit here long term? That's always one of the limitations. When we ask growers a lot of times, what do they expect from the university? Long-term research is one of those. But funding long-term research, funding a 15-year crop rotation study gets really hard. And I'm sure Paul would understand those struggles. So a lot of funding cycles are 3 years at a time for grants. So that's something that we are working on at NREC with some of the agronomists, with actually Justin McMecken there, met with him. And so that's something we're going to be writing some proposals and looking at. Some growers are looking at adding winter wheat through CSP and EQIP. Weed control. So we just started the rounds of pesticide applicator training. I did Columbus yesterday morning, and then on Wednesday had 180 guys there. And what did we talk about the most during integrated pest management? Palmer amaranth, water hemp, and mare's tail. How much problem do you have with mare's tail if you have a good stand of winter wheat? You don't have it, right? Palmer, water hemp, when do they start emerging? May, June? Peak time when you have a nice stand of winter wheat as well. So those early flushes don't even occur. So from the weed standpoint, I think there's, as we deal with more and more herbicide-resistant weeds, and that's happening, we added PPO resistance, so those burners, we now have that in population of Palmer in Nebraska. We also have 2,4-D-resistant water hemp actually already documented in Nebraska. So the question is, at what point is this going to catch up with us? Because it's been a struggle. So I think there's some merit there. Another one on the insect side would be corn rootworm. We have extended diapause in northeast Nebraska. Those northern corn rootworm just don't hatch right away. Well, in a corn soybean rotation, that poses a problem. Adding another crop could be actually adding wheat would be one way to deal with that. And then workload management, like I mentioned. The other one, erosion control. If you have your yield monitor data, what do those eroded hillsides look like for yield compared to the other areas, right? Those show up. I deal with a lot of yield monitor data. One of the other areas I work in is precision ag. We could have added that soil back. What is it worth? Quite a bit. We could have had that topsoil back. We're still dealing with erosion control. NRCS changed how they consider that rill and gully erosion. They're starting to spot check and enforce that, even though they've already was supposed to. I had a grower last night that said, we've been growing wheat just as a cover crop. We plant the whole field of winter wheat as a cover crop. We spray the whole field except where we know water's going to run and cause erosion. We don't spray that until we come back for our post-application burn down. And he said, we've seen hardly any problems with that. And so having wheat growing as a cash crop too during those months where you get those heavy rainfall events in May and June is worth quite a bit in terms of protecting yourself from erosion long term. The other one, a grower mentioned to me this spring, he said, I was so happy that I had planted some acres of winter wheat last fall because with the rainfall pattern and the cold spell, he said it was one less cornfield that I had to plant this spring. So what's happening with rainfall, and Tyler can concur on this, this is data from Fremont from 1897 through 2015. So we have weather data back in Fremont. So what's happening in April? We've seen a significant increase in rainfall in April, going from short of 3 inches to over 3 inches just in the month of April. May, same trend, below 4 inches. So we've added almost over an inch of extra rainfall in those 2 months is the trend. So increased moisture, also less field days available for getting spring field work done. So some of those acres, at least when it comes to winter wheat, but also for moisture, for yield potential, a little less to do for field work than if you have some wheat acres. June, flat. July, a trend is slightly drier. August, slightly drier. And then back in September, about the same. So the overall trend, at least on long-term data in our area, is slightly wetter springs and slightly drier summers. So that's not the trend you'd like to see if you're a corn and soybean farmer. So winter wheat variety selection. Steve kind of led us into this. And I'll show you why I think this is something we need to continue to focus on, even though we have for a long time. So looking at some data and some research that was done in the area, I've done this with corn and soybeans. Where does variety selection rank in terms of other routine management decisions you make on a regular basis? For soybeans, it's number one, 15 bushel difference on average. If you look at third-party variety trials, there's a 15 bushel difference in soybeans from just variety trials that companies submit their material in. So whether you look at first trials, Iowa State's program, South Dakota's program, you'll see that if you look at the same data for winter wheat, 16 bushel difference in varieties on a regular basis. So you look at maybe Overland with pretty common planted variety and some of the newer varieties that we have now in the variety trials. But number one, and that's why I had talked about diseases at our program last night. Stephen Wagulo talked 23 bushels. You heard numbers bigger than that today. I had one grower that didn't get sprayed for stripe rust, and he was 40 bushels less than the farmers that did back in 2015. So foliar fungicides here in a more humid region for growing wheat is really a big priority. And so the question that came up last night is, well, who do I have scout my wheat? Well, I already offered to scout wheat in Dodge and Colfax County for all the guys, and the guy was from Colfax County. He said, how much do I have to pay you to come over to Colfax County? So that might be something. The first thing I thought of, well, how much do we train scouts with companies on wheat? And so I had some people from CVA come to our winter wheat program this summer. So that's an area that a lot of agronomists in this part of the world are deficient in. They haven't had that exposure or training unless they've moved out of state in Eastern Nebraska. So that's something. Row spacing, that came up. So Doug Shoup, a good friend of mine in Eastern South Dakota, he covers Southeast South Dakota as the extension agronomist there. They did a row spacing study over 2 years. So the 2-year average difference was a 16 bushel loss going from 15-inch rows down to, or moving up to 15-inch rows for kind of the east central and southeast parts of Kansas. So the question I have, what's that number here? I don't know, but that's fairly significant, 16 bushel difference over multiple sites and over multiple years down there. Planting date, something that we're working on in Nebraska, something that they're looking at in the Panhandle that I think we need to reevaluate here in Eastern Nebraska. Nitrogen management, they looked at late season N application. If you're maybe short of N, they could pick up 7 bushels and some proteins with just applications at flagleaf. Okay, so there's still a recovery option. And then seeding rate 5. So these are just some of the management practices, but you start adding these all up, especially for people that are growing wheat for the first time. These things happen more often, mismanagement, than people that have been doing it for 20 years, okay? So these are fairly significant. If I'm trying to convince growers in Dodge and Washington County to grow winter wheat, we got to get some of these things right away, because if they had a bad experience year 1, year 2, are they going to do it year 3 and year 4? Probably not. Yes? Yep. Well, on the planning date, no, because I don't have really good, all the planning date recommendations were done decades ago. That's something that we want to reevaluate and do planning dates again, and also looking at a combination of planning date and seeding rate. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Both. Both. That was, and that's coming from Western Nebraska. Yep. Yeah, this was what was identified. When I got done with my talk, we spent 15 minutes and I have a whole marker board full of things that they had questions about. And some of them I knew the answer to, and some we don't have the data for. And we're going to get to some of those today, like chloride, for example, seeding rate, for example, and some of these. So some of this is from adjacent areas that I could get the closest to Eastern Nebraska on. So variety trials. Steve mentioned this, how important this is. The UNL Fall Seed Guide, you can get a PDF online. You can get the variety trial results webpage on CropWatch. There's a virtual page that gives kind of some background on each of the varieties. If you haven't been, Colorado Wheat, their program has a database where they take all the yield data from adjacent states, from Oklahoma, Colorado, Nebraska, multiple states, I think Wyoming. And essentially, you can look at how those varieties did across multiple states if you're wondering about consistency, or it'll analyze a summary for a region. So I can pick Eastern Nebraska over 5 years or something, and it'll analyze all of those versus just looking at, 1 year average. So it's essentially a database that you can kind of custom do what you want to. It'll even do a head-to-head comparison of two varieties across. You could select Northeast Kansas, Southeast Nebraska, head-to-head comparison, and it'll pull the results from all the variety trials in those two regions for a head-to-head comparison. If you're wondering how they've done in variety trials in a region. So I think that's a really nice tool to use to help with variety selection. Just last year, as a part of that winter wheat effort, I created a new page. I've started Crop Tech Cafe 3 years ago when I started. It's essentially a blog or a web page, but I have a winter wheat cafe page where I have a lot of the information that I actually have in this PowerPoint as well. And that's a local resource that I'm continuing to update that growers in my area know they can go to, get the most recent link to a new publication, get the most recent information on variety trials that's specific to our region, okay? So trying to customize that at a very local level is what that's focused on. So where do we have variety trials in Eastern Nebraska? We have one in Clay County, which is just on the fringe of what I consider the eastern growing region here in Nebraska, down with Mark Noble in Jefferson County or area, Lancaster at the NREC there near Meade, and then we added the one in Washington County. So these four get averaged in the variety trial results, but this is one I think is also important to look at when you're looking at variety selection. So just an example of what the variety trial looks like. What I have here is just the commercially released or released varieties. I took the experimentals out. Even though Steve mentioned one of the new ones, the 12561, is a new experimental from the Nebraska program that's done really well in Eastern Nebraska and has kept up with both high yields and is, I think, a wheat that's really going to fit for us in this part of the state. And it looks like they might be moving forward with releasing that in the future. So what are yield potential? So the grower I worked with, the field average at this variety trial, the rest of the field, it was amazing. The plot average was 110, and the field average for the rest of the field was also 110. Okay. So that kind of fell in line. So where were we at? He's normally been planting wolf was what was in that field, and that yielded 130. But when we look at the statistics on this, how do you use this variety trial data? What's this number mean? Right here, difference required for significance at 5%. Sometimes you'll see in variety trials it'll say LSD, which is least significant difference. That's the bushels needed to say two varieties yielded differently at a 95% confidence level, okay? I'm 95% confidence that if there's more than a 13 bushel difference, that's a variety difference. That's not just noise or variability in the data. So that's a pretty large number. When we do corn and soybeans, sometimes, especially first trials, this is another third-party entity, they will give you both the 90% confidence level and the 75. Sometimes you're okay with making a decision on two varieties at 75% confidence versus 95, okay? So there is some choice in that, but this is done at the 95% confidence level. So this top yield group, essentially you take that 13 minus the 139, that top yielding one, and your top yield group is essentially right up here. So Westbred, Zenda, Cedar, 4303. We'll go through some of these plus and minuses and one that I think fit in Eastern Nebraska. But there's a lot of other important information on here. Test weight, plant height, lodging. That was a big one for us. So at this variety trial, we even had a later one. We had a May storm and a June storm where we had 60 and 80 mile-an-hour winds at this location. So some of the long-term checks like turkey were essentially flat. We had some other varieties that were flat, but yet we had some varieties, for example, that were still 0% lodged even after those two windstorms in May and June. So in terms of standability, that's a high priority for the two of the growers I've worked with. They said that's been a problem long-term for them is lodging. So that's one of the things they were really looking at. Stripe rust. Stephen Wagulo presented how many years we've dealt with higher incidence and severity of stripe rust. It's becoming a consistent problem compared to what it was before. Grain protein. Fremont, for example, one of the growers I worked with at ADM, they spoke last night. One of the growers got a 25-cent premium, plus he got 20 cents over futures when he hauled in. ADM 2 weeks ago was 60 cents over futures. They said looking at new crop wheat between basis and potential premium, you could get $1 more above futures. So I think they were all the way, I think it was like 535 is some of the numbers they were talking about for price in Fremont. So that's a real plus if you're in that area. And people from South Dakota, Kansas haul all the way to Fremont. That's partially because they're dropping off wheat and then they're picking up meal or some other products to haul back. So there's some other incentives going on just besides that. So definitely a plus for us in Eastern Nebraska. So some of the recommended varieties, Wolf has been probably the most consistent in terms of the variety trials that UNL's done over the past couple years. It moves north well. It did really well also in South Dakota when I was up there. So we know that it moves north well in terms of winter hardiness. Great standability, good early disease resistance, bacterial leaf streak. Steve mentioned that one. When we did ratings for bacterial streak in South Dakota, which was becoming more of a problem, this one actually did pretty well as some of the other varieties. It's been the yield leader over the past 3 years. So a lot of the growers I'm working with, when you have 1 or 2 fields, unfortunately, they're just going to pick one variety, right? Because it's just the way it is, unless you have more acres. So I usually have to tell them, which one variety do I get? And so this is where a lot of the growers are starting out for the first time. Westbred Cedar has been around a little bit for a while, but it's done really well. High yield potential. It's one of the earliest maturing varieties, good resistance to powdery mildew, and hopefully early harvest. We're going to find out. So most of the ratings for maturity are based on when essentially you get to heading, date to heading. And then that can be different than date to actually harvest, okay? So some varieties can flower early, but might still have a longer grain fill than others, okay? This is one that we think is on the earlier side. So I have one grower that planted cedar after seed corn on September 23rd, a day and a half before it started raining for 3 weeks. So that was well timed. And he's hoping by planting it on the earlier side of that recommended window that he can also get it out. And he put it under a quarter of pivot. And so he's going to try to see if he can get out early enough. We looked with a soybean model, look at what maturity would we need to plant if it's first week of July, given frost and everything. So we're going to try that. So climate has changed a little bit. That first frost has changed a little bit, so we're going to push that envelope further north. Normally, this is kind of cut off, south of Lincoln, where we've been able to make this work. Yeah, so he had seed corn before. Yep, and luckily he did not put on much atrazine, so that's usually the biggest thing in that program. No, they sprayed this with salt solution. It's pretty common, and they pretty much had salted out or killed all the weeds when they did that as well. So there was very little weed pressure in his seed corn field. The main thing he was worried about was volunteer corn coming up, which I said, well, that'll die off here once you get a hard freeze, obviously. So the biggest concern here was when you plant September 23rd seed corn, that's fine. Everything was brown and dead, so I'm not worried about a green ridge. But there's also adjacent regular commercial corn that was green, right? So we'll have to see. Haven't seen much, but wheat curl mite would be more of a concern in that situation. Ruth, one Steve mentioned, a new one from University of Nebraska. Good standability for its height. It's a taller wheat. It's really, I view it as a replacement for Overland. If you're interested in straw production, which you guys are, great. It's moved north well into South Dakota. So it's a fuller season variety, but I think a real good one. Freeman, one that was reached a few years earlier, great yield, moves north well. In terms of nitrogen efficiency, they've looked at this one, and for pound for nitrogen you add, it's really very efficient at utilizing and capturing nitrogen there. So if you're short a little bit, maybe it won't hurt you as much. My biggest concern with this in the eastern part of the state is standability. We've had some issues with this variety in some of those high yield environments and some of the storms we have. It's really viewed as a replacement for Camelot and Wesley. It's a slightly earlier side on maturity. Westbred 4303, actually this is as a check and in the borders around the plots this year. This one's done really well the last 2 years. This will be the 3rd year in the variety trial, so we'll have that 3-year average to look at. So that's why it's still in the promising category when we have 2 years of data. The current variety program, they look at 3 years average before they say, here's recommended. So I think this one has potential. Early maturing, great standability, one of the only ones that didn't lodge in the plot where we had those high yields. Test weight's a little low, and then stripe rust. Out of all the ones out of this promising recommended section, it's the weakest on stripe rust. So it's definitely one you're going to have to scout and probably spray if we have issues. I view it as a replacement for their Westbred Cedar. It kind of fits that same same niche. Westbred 4458. This was the one that topped the trial, at least at Washington County. Great standability, weakness. We had quite a bit of powdery mildew at least at the location up in Washington County, but obviously, even though it had powdery mildew, it still was able to perform well. My biggest concern, a grower did plant this year, is Fusarium head blight. We know that this one has not typically done well. This has normally been more of an irrigated wheat further west. Westbred Grainfield, one that's really done well across the region from Oklahoma all the way up to South Dakota and east to west, so probably one of the more multi-purposes wheat in this lineup. Great disease package, straw, yield, standability is an issue. And then the second one is protein. Looking at the protein results, this one's been consistently lower on the protein. When I run that Colorado multi-site, multi-year analysis, it's been lower on protein. So that would be one of the concerns with this variety. And then Zenda, which is one I'm most excited about as one of the promising varieties that just got released. This is from K-State. It is a replacement for Everest, because what happened to Everest was the most commonly planted wheat in Kansas, but it's just got nailed by stripe rust, right? So improved stripe rust, it's related obviously to Everest. I think they recrossed it, so it'd be, I don't know if it's a sibling or what you would consider that, but they kept the moderately resistant Fusarium head blight rating. So it still has the same level of resistance to Fusarium head blight as Everest had, which is why it's such a popular wheat in eastern Kansas. So that's a big plus. Standability has been great. And guess what? It's actually a little bit, it's not as early as Everest. It's a little bit longer maturity, and it's actually done really well here in eastern Nebraska. So I think it might actually be a better fit for us than Everest was. So we'll have to wait and see and get another year. But that Fusarium head blight is one that I'm really think that this makes it promising. So there's just a highlight of some of the varieties based on those. Those are essentially based on yield data. Those recommended ones are based on 3-year averages, gave the plus and minuses. The promising have had 2 years of data. We'll have a third. We do have some new ones in the variety trial. There's actually 31 varieties that were planted this fall. I do have the list in case you are curious. Here I didn't put it up there, but we have a good amount of soybean or wheat varieties entered in the variety trial this year again across those locations. So recommended planting practices. One, and maybe it's speaking to the crowd, but certified seed is probably the one thing I always tell people to start with. Make sure you know what you're getting. You're paying for the variety you got, that you have a seed tag. You know what the germ purity, seed size is on that, and that comes important to calculating your seed rate. So that's available to see who's close near you for picking up seed. Fortunately for us too, we're close enough to Saunders County where there's quite a few certified growers. And then actually Kelp in West Point is carry seed and is actually a dealer for Westbred. So we have some places close up our way, and that was an initial concern as we move further northeast in Nebraska. A lot less access to certified seed growers as we move north. So this is a basic Excel tool. Here it is on the Crop Tech Cafe. It is essentially you can pick, using university recommendations, you pick what week you think you're going to be planting. Obviously, that might change. It puts in what the recommended pure live seeding rate would be for that week. You put in from your tag, your blue tag, what the germination, purity, and seed size is. It'll then tell you a seeding rate in pounds per acre, bushels per acre. I've then added down here size of field, because a lot of guys only have 20 acres, so they can put in 20 acres and it'll tell them how many bags they need to order, because they're mostly dealing with bags at the size of fields up in this area. So this is something some of the other people saw, and we're hoping to expand this Excel tool. So instead of a EC guide that has a table of what the seeding rate should be, it would just be an Excel tool instead for the whole state. So at least moving I think in a good direction. It'd be great to have it as an online tool that's not even Excel in the future. Planting depth and fungicide seed treatment. I always recommend a fungicide seed treatment. So does the extension plant pathologist as well. Planting depth. I think probably the easiest thing to do. In our area, generally, we have pretty good moisture most falls. I like to see 1.5 inches for a depth. Obviously, some varieties have longer coleoptiles than other, but at that 1.5 inch, we're safe on all the varieties that are recommended and promising for this area of the state. We get enough moisture. I guess I'm not as concerned that. So especially for people starting out new, I think that's a really good place to start, is that 1.5 inches. So under an inch, I'm concerned about winter hardiness and having that crown too close to the surface. You can go down the 2 inches, but below 2 inches, some of those varieties that are shorter, that starts to be a concern if you plant them too deep as well. So in terms of winter hardiness, that sweet spot, at least we found in South Dakota, was between 1 inch and 2 inches, or about 1.5 inches for winter hardiness, which was more of a concern. Again, planting no-till also. Experience being further north here, no-till and planting 1.5 inches have been a pretty good combination for winter hardiness, and having that extra little bit of soybean stubble makes a big difference. Here's, depending on where you guys are at in the room, I showed the group this last night. Some of them had never seen this certified tag before. There is a nice crop watch article that you can find on this, but what you need to know is seed size, obviously germ purity, some of these numbers to plug in that Excel spreadsheet, right? So you can get your target seeding rate. If you don't account for seeding rate, and many of you know on wheat, it can vary quite a bit, right? You could have 10,000 seeds, you could have 20,000. I've seen that on generally from variety trial results. To equate this to corn growers in the area I'm working in, if your target was 28,000 plants per acre, would you be happy if you're a planter and you just planted 18,000 or 38,000 for a corn plant population? The answer is no. And that can happen if you don't pay attention on wheat, especially for first starting out. So we did put in, besides the small plot variety trial, that doesn't always give us the best judge for diseases as well as lodging. When you have a plot that's 5 foot wide and 15 foot long, we do rate, yes, there's 5 reps. So that ends up being 30 times 5 for plots. But for what lodging across hills and environments, and also what diseases look like across the top of the hill down into the draw, one of the growers was interested that just planted wheat for the first time. So this is part of a 60-acre field he planted. We put just essentially just a variety strip trial. So we have a check of wolf next to every other variety here. And so we have 4269, Cedar, 4458, 4303, Zenda, Ruth, and then we have Ruth with biological in there. And so this was planted across the whole quarter-mile long up and down hills. And so this will be another observation point for us. We had what our target seeding rates, what the drill setting was, and then what we actually got. So we actually shot backed it out when we were and weighed it. And this is how close we got to our target, even accounting for what was on the seed tag and the drill settings. Okay, 95% of what we were shooting for, 95, 107, 110, 123. So if you've done wheat before, it's close. If you get close, you're happy, but there is variability. And so every year you need to do this. At least a lot of our growers are using like 5400 Case IH drills. And because that changes every time, I think one of these, the shape of the seed, this 4269 was a lot different than some of the other ones. And I think it just flowed through that square opening a lot better than some of the other seed did observations. So again, calibrating your drill, I think is a really important step. And you have to, if you have onboard weighing, that makes things a lot easier. But if you don't, a lot of growers starting out don't have a lot for a drill. And so the only way to know is to put a certain amount in and plant a certain amount of acres, or put some in and take it out and weigh it. Crop insurance, really the dates haven't changed over time. For East Central and Southeast, full insurance coverage through the 15th of October, late planting through the 30th. I had growers that said, hey, with the rain, it's now the first week of November. Can I go ahead and still plant? I already have the seed. And so they did, of course. But we upped the seeding rate, right, to compensate for less tillering. Nutrient management. So I have my macronutrients here. You got to remember my micronutrients are an area that I'm obviously interested, spent 3.5 years looking at that. But nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, okay? Those are the macronutrients that I'm going to talk about here in winter wheat for Eastern Nebraska. And out of all these micronutrients, to be honest with you, the only one that I'm really concerned about is chloride. And I'll tell you why. So for nitrogen, in our area, that was the first thing as an agronomist for corn. And then wheat, what's nitrogen input is one of your biggest inputs or cost. So you don't want to over fertilize because it costs money, but you don't under fertilize, right? And short yourself on protein and yield. The nitrogen rate recommendations for University of Nebraska have mostly been for central and western Nebraska. So the question I have when I move back here is how good is our nitrogen recommendations for this far east? So because if you look at Kansas and South Dakota, they'll recommend both of those state recommendations near us are significantly higher N rates than what we recommend. So if you say you're going to be over 70 bushel yield, it adds an additional, I think, 20 pounds in our model. And if you want an extra percent protein, it adds some more in the university algorithm. That gets us pretty close to this 90 and 110 pounds, which the growers up in Dodge and Washington have been playing with, is about where they're at, okay? I would like to see more nitrogen rate studies done in the future, either on farm or by University of Nebraska to fine tune this, because it's just an important piece of the puzzle. Timing, in terms of risk management, but also in terms of yield and potential nitrogen loss, I really like applying most of that nitrogen in the spring at green up. This year in our area, I'm encouraging the growers to go out there a little bit on the early side to where they have, because we essentially got no fall tillering. Most everything was October 18th or later, so we really didn't have a lot of fall tillering. Slightly earlier N application in the spring has been shown to help a little bit with spring tillering and yield versus putting that off a little bit later in springs like this, where the wheat's a little bit further behind. In terms of N recovery, I mentioned this. This was work that was done in this part of the state. They looked at putting nitrogen on at flagleaf to see if they could still help out with protein and the yield, and the answer was yes to both. So if you think you're short, they still found that economically speaking, that it was worth it to put some extra nitrogen on, if you were on the low side. Phosphorus. For one grower, he didn't realize that the phosphorus requirement was higher for wheat than it was for corn and soybeans. So we already have a wheat crop that was in lower phosphorus than I would have liked. The critical level is 25 part per million on a Bray P1. For soybeans, it's 12. For corn, it's 17. But if you're corn after corn, it's 25. So there's a difference. Alfalfa is also 25. So phosphorus requirement a little higher. Early growth, phosphorus really helps with, and with winter hardiness. So it's something that we need to have. Sulfur. Some of you can probably speak to this in this further south. We haven't noticed this, at least in Dodge and Washington County, but I know Randy Pryor has seen this quite a bit down closer to Kansas and southeast Nebraska. And I saw this when I was doing nitrogen work in wheat, also in north central and northeast Kansas. We saw sulfur deficiency on eroded hillsides in the spring, mostly in no-till fields. So obviously the whole plant's pale yellow, usually on the newer leaves. The basic recommendation is just to apply 15 to 20 pounds of sulfur, depending liquid or dry, depending on your system. So chloride, probably the biggest concern I have. There hasn't been research done on chloride since at least 1950 in eastern Nebraska here, okay? They did some chloride studies out in the Panhandle and didn't find much yield response or benefit when they did those studies not that long ago. If you look at Kansas research, my PhD advisor there is the soil fertility extension specialist, Dorvar Ruiz-Diaz. He did a meta-analysis. So he took all 50-some studies of chloride studies in Kansas, dug all that data up and ran that across that whole data set. It's called the meta-analysis. And across that, they found an 8% increase in yield across central and eastern Kansas with just 20 pounds of chloride, okay? A lot of that's coming from slight depression and some suppression of diseases. They've also looked at what if the chloride was fall applied versus top dressed in the spring and found they were about performed the same in their studies, okay? So in terms of, I've talked to the soil fertility specialists here, and they said, you know, do you have any concerns with me promoting chloride? And they said, no, environmentally speaking, you know, there's not concerns like there is with phosphorus and nitrogen. You don't have any data. And so the question is, well, what are the chloride levels in our soil? And what would those interpretations look like based on Kansas, okay? So Kansas recommendations are if you take a 2-foot core in the fall, 0 to 24-inch sample in the fall, And if you're below 4 part per million soil test chloride, they recommend 20 pounds in Kansas. South Dakota has a similar recommendation. So north and south of us, they have chloride recommendations. So what were the levels I saw? So any grower that was interested this fall that planted wheat for the first time or had been doing, if they wanted me to take soil samplings and scout, I was going to offer that for free for this year. And we'll see if I get too many people taking me up on that. I might have to back up on that offer. But so I went and took soil samples this fall on all fields, 0 to 6, 0 to 24 on everybody's field. So that was 6 growers, 7 fields. Soil test chloride, remember I said less than 4 was the max recommendation to get that full 20 pounds. Levels were 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, and 2. And one of these, that was the wheat after seed corn. Actually, the nitrate level wasn't as high as I thought after seed corn, but we had a lot of fall moisture, right? We had a lot of rain September, first 2 weeks of October, all low. So by current recommendations in adjacent states, it would say that we need that 20 pounds of chloride. I would like to get some on-farm research strips with growers. So if you're interested in doing with and without chloride, if that's not part of your system, if it already is, I can try to convince you, but I probably won't try too hard to take it out. But I think this is something that we can look at on farm to get some data quickly versus trying to do small plot data and trying to find funding for it. I'm one of the third wheel on the on-farm research group with Laura Thompson and Keith Lund. So we've really got some good projects going with farmers across the state. So this would be one area I see in wheat to look at on the nutrient side. Yes. Yeah, I don't know. There's a couple different sulfur tests. This is one, and it measures more than just sulfate actually in the test. And Tim might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't know, you know, on the one from Midwest that they're running, where we need to be at for that. So the one question I have after soybeans, typically we assume for corn, you know, I think 3 to 4 part per million as a default if you didn't take a test, right? And so you would assume I'd get values close to that, and I did, you know, if you would look at the average of these. So not a lot of nitrate, nitrogen left in that top 2 feet, you know, in the fall going into wheat yet. A little bit on disease management. We had 40 minutes worth of disease education last night for the growers up there. But kind of the short of it, we've already mentioned these diseases: scab, Fusarium head blight, stripe, and leaf rust. Probably the biggest concerns. Variety selection, field scouting, and fungicides really is where that comes into play. So trying to use all of those. Scouting being a big one, and timeliness on getting things sprayed. If you don't have a copy, if you take the pesticide applicator training, you get it as a part of your training, but it's a new guide every year. Is that the weed guide? And this year it looks gray. How many have gotten this in the past? Okay. It has a lot of good information in terms of both the disease and herbicide information for wheat. Obviously, things change over time. The ratings change, new products. So this is something I think worth getting in terms of, but, you know, Carumba, Fusarium are both, you know, products that have good ratings and are good products to use in terms of controlling for disease around that heading time. Last year it happened to be that we could spray for stripe rust and Fusarium head blight at the same time. Stripe rust came in late enough in our area that was a 2-for-1, but that doesn't always happen that way, does it? Yes. Yep. Yes. The main concern is if you're the mode of action. So there's both a triazole and a strombularin, a 3 and an 11. You don't want to spray a strombularin when it's flowering, because actually that can increase the vomitoxin in the amount if you have a Fusarium head blight issue. So you just want to spray a triazole, these products only at heading. Before that, the strombularins work really good for rust. So just the only no-no is not having that strombularin at that Fusarium head blight rating, or timing. It could make things worse instead of better, which doesn't make sense, but is what happens. In terms of the really early ones, that would be a good question for our pathologist, Stephen Lagula, to see if they've done any work on early applications and control on those products. But overall, he said that the fungicides really work well on these rust diseases, are pretty effective. In terms of your tan spot, some of your other diseases, there's the ratings that we could look at in here. I don't know them off the top of my head. That's a good question. With that, I'm kind of wrapped up. I think I had till 11:30, so 3 minutes over. Again, the local information I have on my blog, I think, is still pertinent to you guys down here. It's really some of the information on here. We'll probably try to migrate to the winter wheat page on CropWatch. Initially, I just threw it up here. I have all the pictures of the variety trials. It's easy to throw it on a blog than it is to do it on the university website. We are working on, so that you know, I started this winter working on a grower's guide for growing wheat in Eastern Nebraska. So it would be a new EC or new NEB guide that would probably be mostly online, could be hard copy. And I was surprised. I asked for help thinking I'd get a handful of people, and I think I have 15 people willing to contribute to the grower's guide for Eastern Nebraska. But with 15 people, it also is going to be a little bit slower maybe. But we have an outline approved, things that we thought were important to cover. We want to make a draft of that and then get feedback from growers before we actually put it out there, because guess what? Agronomists don't know the answers to everything either. So, and sometimes growers do. So, yes. Yeah, just because of the yield gain that they've seen with additional releases, like with the West Spread 4303, it looks like that one, has a similar height, similar, package, that number is probably kind of going to replace or fit Cedar. So just the genetic gain in over, 6 years time accumulates. So I think we'll see some of the newer West bred ones replace that in their lineup over time. But like if it fits and it's still producing well and it's still on that recommended list, we'll see what it does this next year. It's starting to trickle down in terms of yield when we do those 3-year averages.